Tonight, for the third time, we have Adair Turner back to share with us his thinking and his vitality. And to introduce him is Norbert Herring, who is a correspondent from Handelsblatt, who you all know have been very, very important to the development of this conference, who helped set the stage on the 24th of January in Frankfurt, where we had a conference under their leadership on new economic thinking. And perhaps most importantly, there is a new rebel economic thinking organization called the World Economic Association that Norbert has co-founded to create a platform for the economists of the future. I'm very excited to have Norbert here with us, and please welcome him as he introduces Adair Turner.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's certainly not at all necessary, but it's a very great honor and an even greater pleasure for me to introduce as our dinner speaker tonight, Lord Adair Turner. Lord Turner has the rare distinction of combining three different and distinguished careers, one in business, one in finance, and one in public service. But that's not even the main reason why he's such a fitting speaker for a conference of the Institute of New Economic Thinking. Lord Turner is also an extremely smart economist who is not afraid to think things and to say things that are not usually part of the economic discourse. Since I've been following his speeches and his writings, I've been impressed by many things. But what I've been most impressed is how singularly unafraid he is to talk about subjects and to use expressions that are normally taboo, like the expression credit creation. Think about the difference. The okay term to use for what banks do is financial intermediation. The taboo term credit creation implies that banks don't just take the money from savers and give it to borrowers, but it implies that in the process of lending out money, banks actually create money. That it's a taboo you can infer from the fact, taboo at least in academic circles, that the term basically does not appear in any established finance journal. It has certainly helped for him to be so courageous that Lord Turner does not and never has relied on establishing his reputation by publishing as much as possible in the established journals. Instead, he has a career in business, where one of his achievements is to build up the Eastern European and Russian activities of McKinsey. He's also acted as Director General of the Confederation of British Industries. In finance, he looks back to distinguished roles like Vice Chairman of Merrill Lynch Europe, and he had, among other similar roles, the role of non-executive director at Standard Chartered Bank. In 2008, he was appointed as chairman of the Financial Services Authority in London. So it's clear that it matters what Lord Turner thinks matters in this crisis, as is the title of his speech tonight, What Matters. Other roles in public service, and again, that's only a selection, include heading the Low Pay Commission in Britain, being chairman of the Pension Committee, and most recently, and still, chairman of the Commission on Climate Change. So you see, he was really dealing with a lot of distinct and very important issues. In his speech tonight, Lord Turner will draw on that very broad range of perspective that he has gained in all these quite distinct roles. He knows the inner workings and the fragilities of a financial institution. He understands the financing needs and the alternatives or lack of alternatives of companies. And he takes the perspective of a policymaker who has to take the interlinkages between the financial sector and the real economy into account. And that's where Lord Turner's focus, among other focuses on credit creation, comes in. He rightly sees the ups and downs of private bank money creation as a major influence on the business cycle, and probably more importantly, as a major factor that influences the level of financial stability or instability that's building up. So I'm not the right one to talk about this, I'm afraid, so I'll give the word to Adair. Please treat us to one of your thought-provoking speeches. Thank you very much.
Norbert, thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Rob, as well. It is a great pleasure to be here at this third INET annual meeting, and a great pleasure, Rob, that you have invited me for the third time to, as it were, play this gig at dinner on this evening. You invited me about 9 months ago, and there's always this strategy that people use when they invite you to speak at something, where they invite you so far in advance that you cannot credibly say that the date is already taken. And in particular, if you've ended up as being a bit of a friend, as I have with Rob Johnson, it becomes impossible to say no. So I said, yes, I will come. And the only trouble is that you then sort of put that in the back drawer and forget it for 9 months. And as a result, I feel a little bit unprepared for this speech this evening. Some of you will have seen me scribbling at the back of the room during the day as I tried to work out what I was going to say. So if my speech sounds a little bit unprepared, I suggest you do what we always do in the present circumstances and blame the bankers. Because I keep looking forward to the point in my life where the financial crisis will sort of calm down and will have got into calm waters, but so far this never appears to occur. Now, once you've accepted to speak at anything at INET, as all the speakers here know, an incredibly effective organization leaps into action and bombards you with these emails asking you for your paper and your title and telling you how you're going to be briefed and who the other panel members are. And the initial strategy that one deploys under this is to pretend that one has not received the email. But after a while, one is worn down by it. And so you have to commit to a title. And at some stage in the past, I must have said, well, if you must, I'll give you a title of What Matters, Fundamental Challenges and Self-Inflicted Wounds. And I think I deliberately chose that so that it could sort of mean anything I wanted, and therefore there were total degrees of freedom still on the day to talk about whatever I cared about. But it's not a bad title, because I think it is important for INET in particular to keep asking not just what are the answers to economic questions, but what are the crucial questions that we need to ask? What is the agenda of problems that we should be addressing? And that, of course, relates to a somewhat wider question as to why do we need new economic thinking, and in what sense do we need new economic thinking? Rob suggested in his speech yesterday that we could just as well have called this institute the Institute for Sound Economic Thinking, and that there was indeed a bit of a problem with calling it New Economic Thinking, since it seems in part to be the Institute for reading old economic books. Schumpeter, Hayek, Keynes, Minsky. And in one of those books, in indeed his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, Keynes had something to say on the importance of economics. First, he suggested that within 100 years of his writing, the economic problem, as he called it, would largely have been solved. in the sense that productivity improvement and capital accumulation would have lifted everybody in developed countries to a level of prosperity in which all primary needs were fundamentally satisfied. Second, therefore, he urged the following. He said, do not let us overstate the importance of the economic problem. And finally, he observed, if economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent people on a level with dentists, then that would be splendid. So I would like this evening to welcome you all to the 3rd annual convention of the Institute of New Economic Dentistry and to ask, as dentists who aspire to be competent, what are the priority areas on which we should focus? Are we, most importantly, in the business of crisis response, pain relief, and emergency repair to the tooth system? Or should we be focused on preventing the self-inflicted problems of decay created by addiction to credit sugar? And in relation to that aspect of dentistry, I must say I was shocked. Some of you may not have been back to your room since the conference finished, but if you have, you will notice that every one of us has been given a package of Haribo Gold Baron. And as I think as an undermining of the principle of this dental convention, I cannot imagine anything more severe. Or finally, should we be sort of economic orthodontists involved in the structural reforms to put the teeth in a finer structural form for the future? What are the issues that we should talk about? Well, as Rob also said yesterday, the original impulse to set up INET was the financial crisis, and was a sense that there had been a set of bad regulatory and macro policies informed in turn by deficient economic theory, which had played a key role in the origins of that crisis. Much of the agenda of the first annual meeting at Cambridge was devoted specifically to the financial crisis and financial economics. Much of last year also in Bretton Woods as well. And today has been devoted pretty much entirely to the issues of debt, deleveraging, macro imbalance, etc. And that focus on the financial crisis and its aftermath is clearly essential and justified. The financial crisis has caused enormous harm in terms of lost income and employment, households facing negative equity, in some cases repossession. And it has forced fiscal austerity programs, which in many countries are stretching social cohesion to the limits. So it is essential that we understand the origins of this crisis, why it was so bad, but also, as Bill Janeway said yesterday, why it was not even worse. Why, although a bad financial crisis, it was nothing like as bad as 1929 to 33, and what we need to do to keep making sure that it stays nothing like as bad as 1929 to 33 and thereafter. For as Bill said, when you actually look back at 1933, for instance in the US, to the situation which Franklin Roosevelt faced on coming into office, what is striking is just how enormously severe the problems were. Output had fallen not by 3 or 5 or 7 or 8%, but by about 25%. Unemployment was at 25 to 30%, not just in specific countries and regions or specific age groups, but across entire continental economies in both the US and Europe. And yet, it's quite interesting that faced with that total disaster, Roosevelt, in his inauguration speech, made an interesting and fairly optimistic point. He said, our distress arises, he said, not from any failure of substance. We are not stricken by a plague of locusts. And he was right, because the depression of the early 1930s in the US and in Europe did not come about, in a sense, as a result of fundamental challenges, fundamental constraints on resource availability, or fundamental competitive forces at work either externally or internally. The US was not made poor by a sudden shift, adverse shift in its terms of trade. Nor was it made poor by a sudden stop in the ability of its businesses to develop new innovations and new productivity-enhancing steps forward. Nor indeed, unlike, I think it's fair to say, the stagflation of the 1960s and 70s, nor was it caused by a process of internal competition in which different social groups demanded impossible combinations of the economic machine. The 60s and 70s, I think, were an environment where people were demanding of governments public expenditures without being willing to pay the tax to support it, and in which in some countries trade unions were able effectively to demand inflationary wage increases. There was, as it were, a distributional conflict which was irreconcilable and which produced an impact in inflation. But that was not what happened in 29 to 33. As Roosevelt suggested, the problems were essentially self-inflicted. They derived from imperfections, ineffectiveness of financial and macroeconomic arrangements, and in particular from the failure to organize effectively the processes of monetary organization, from what Barry Eichengreen has called the golden fetters of the commodity money gold standard. And equally, the financial crisis which occurred in the developed world in 2008 was almost entirely a self-inflicted wound. It was not something which was enforced on us by a loss of competitiveness with other countries, a loss of relative terms of trade effects. It was not enforced on us by irresponsible trade unions or, on the whole, by over-profligate governments. It was not enforced on us by irreconcilable distributional conflicts. It was fundamentally enforced on us by dramatic failings in a financial system which developed an inherent riskiness which, as economic dentists, we had failed to diagnose, and which many in our profession had openly lauded that development of the financial system as a driver of improved allocative efficiency, increased growth, and ever-increased stability. This is a huge self-inflicted wound, and I'll come back later to some thoughts on how we should respond to it, both to repair the damage and to prevent a repeat. And my starting point will be the assumption that there ought to be win-win solutions, precisely because we are not struggling here with resource constraints, technological impossibilities, or irreconcilable conflicts within our society. But before I turn to that problem of that huge self-inflicted wound, I'd like to put forward some thoughts and questions on perhaps what we might think are more fundamental challenges. And the question is, alongside the self-inflicted wounds of financial instability, what are the longer-term challenges that we face and which good economics need to help with their resolution? And I'm going to comment on three. First of all, long-term growth. Secondly, inequality. And third, climate change. The first, I'm going to suggest, is not really a problem at all. The second, inequality, I'm going to suggest is a huge, complex, and possibly almost entirely intractable problem. And the third, I'm going to suggest, is fundamental but utterly tractable, provided we have political will and good economic policy. First, then, the challenge of maintaining long-term growth. I'm not going to say much on this because I think actually I did talk about it last year, and it is the subject of chapter 1 of the book, which you are either sitting on because you didn't notice or is in front of you. And I have to tell you, chapter 1 is only 30 pages long, so you can jolly well read it yourself and get the key messages from that. But in essence, I suggest in that book that while achieving growth in measured GDP per capita is still an extremely important objective, let us say, for the bottom 2 billion of the world, who have not yet come out of primary poverty, and still a fairly important objective for middle-income countries yet to achieve developed economy standards of living, that both empirical evidence and a priori logic suggest that once you get to the sort of standards of living reached by the developed world in the last 30 years, further improvements of measured average GDP per capita do not of themselves have much potential to drive further improvements in happiness or life satisfaction or well-being or whatever the word we use. And thus that Keynes was broadly right when in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, he argued that within a few generations from his time, which means effectively about now, the steady progress of technological innovation and capital accumulation would have delivered the potential for standards of living which can satisfy pretty much all absolute or primary needs, as he called them, and with a labor input requirement, a number of hours devoted to the production process, which can allow for very extensive leisure hours. I think Keynes was right. That doesn't mean I'm against long-term growth. In fact, I think it's the highly likely and acceptable byproduct of an economic freedom which is desirable in itself. I just suggest that maximizing growth is not a very sensible objective, and that stability of growth and the avoidance of setbacks to growth, the loss of employment or of wealth and income already attained, is massively more important to human satisfaction and social cohesion than squeezing out the last few percentage points of allocative efficiency and the last few points of a percentage point of growth. The precise... I'm having a problem with the light. Can we have another light on here? It's quite difficult to see my... I don't know whether the people in charge can throw a light. I'll leave that as a challenge in a minute, and I'll struggle with it for now. I haven't the faintest idea what this says, actually. Yes, no, I do. That conclusion is the precise opposite, however, of the implicit assumption of pre-crisis policy, in which financial innovation and complexity was justified by its ability minutely to improve, it was said, allocative efficiency, a justification which was meant to be justifiable even at the expense of instability. So to me, long-term growth in developed rich societies is not a fundamental challenge. But I'd like to suggest that rising inequality may be, and also that rising inequality may in part be occurring precisely because we have, in Keynes's terms, solved the economic problem. The figures are certainly startling. They were set out in the excellent OECD report, which Angel Gurria waved at us earlier, and they were illustrated on that fascinating Leaning Man exhibit, which some of you may have seen over at the conference center at the bottom of the stairs. Inequality is rising within developed economies and within emerging, and it's rising on several dimensions. Typically, we are seeing the poorest deciles falling away from the median of the income distribution, but typically, and this is really an interesting and different feature of the last 15 years, even more dramatically, we are seeing the top decile moving away from the median, the top percentile moving away from the rest of the top decile, and the top percentiles of the top percentile moving away dramatically from the poor, dear, old, only slightly rich rest of the top percentile. Now, the drivers of this increasing inequality are, I think, imperfectly understood and undoubtedly multifaceted. I think globalization is undoubtedly a factor of work in a number of complex ways. But I think we also need to face the possibility that rising inequality at the pre-tax level might be an inherent consequence of a combination of technological developments and of the consumer preferences of consumers in already rich societies. I don't have time to present that argument in full, but simply to provoke your thinking on that issue, which I think is an important one, I want to set out 4 thoughts. First, manufacturing jobs are going to go on declining and declining and declining because of our relentless ability to improve productivity. We sometimes get confused about why manufacturing is declining as a percentage of jobs because there's a set of complicated international movements going on. So some manufacturing jobs have moved from America to China as a result of China's competitiveness. And in Europe, German manufacturing employment decline has been slower than UK manufacturing decline. So sometimes we focus on these international effects. But just remember the simple fact that Chinese manufacturing employment has declined in the last 15 years. And the fundamental drivers of declining manufacturing employment are not about shifts from one country to another. They are about our relentless ability to build machines that produce manufactured goods. It's as simple as that. And it is highly likely that in future, if you look at the whole world manufacturing employment, that is going to go on declining as a percentage of total employment. And that's not because the jobs are moving to the moon. It's not because of that competitiveness problems. It's simply a repeat in manufacturing of what happened in agriculture. In 1900, 40% or so of our workforces were employed in manufacture. But by the end of the century, we had worked out how to produce all the food that a rich developed country needs with only 2 or 3% of people employed in manufacture. And I see no reason why, by mid-century, it will not be the case that we are producing all the manufactured goods that the world needs across the whole world with less than 10% of the workforce employed in manufacture and possibly as low as 5%. My second point is that information technology is an extraordinary technology. It is able to deliver huge functionality, highly valued at an incredibly low resource input cost. That is because software is infinitely replicable at pretty much zero marginal cost. Once you've developed one software version, a billion software versions don't require any more resource cost. And because on the hardware side, in physical terms, Moore's law applies, and that has the economic consequence that the cost of delivering increased functionality and the resource input needed to deliver increased functionality just keeps collapsing. And as a result, information and communications technology is a stunningly important technology to us which creates very, very few jobs. Walmart employs 2 million people worldwide. Apple, now the biggest company in the world by stock market value, employs just 50,000, and 36,000 of those are in the retail stores. And even if you add the manufacturing people in Foxconn in China, you don't transform those figures. Facebook, this enormous company, employs 4,000 people and has just bought for $1 billion a company which employs 13 people. In Keynes's terms, we are solving the economic problem of how to produce goods and services with reduced labor input in a stunningly successful fashion, which has overwhelmed even the predictions that he made. But that does leave us with a problem of what jobs people are going to do and at what wage levels. Now, let me be clear, I do not mean by that any sort of lump of labor fallacy, that there is a limit to the number of jobs. Nor have I a sort of only factory jobs are real jobs romanticism. I think there are lots of new things to be done in healthcare, in personal service activities, in leisure, in entertainment. And I'm also enough of a believer in conventional economics to believe that if we have a combination of flexible labor markets and adequate nominal demand, new jobs will emerge and we can achieve full employment. But what I don't know is what the wage levels of that full employment will be. And I think it is at least possible that as we move forward into a richer world and an IT dominated world, that the market clearing pattern of relative wages may be one which commits us to relentlessly rising pre-tax inequality. And I also believe, my third point on this, that the consumer preferences of people whose basic needs have already been satisfied may tend increasingly to generate super returns, super economic rents, to those individuals or companies who have superior skills in branding, fashion, design, new product creation. As consumers get richer, they can afford to spend their money not on products that they absolutely need, but on products which they value for novelty, for brand, for fashion, for design. And that often means on products where the resource input requirement is incredibly small relative to the value delivered, be it the latest iPad, or the fashion good that proves you are up with or ahead of the crowd, or the brand endorsed by the sporting or entertainment celebrity. And the willingness to purchase that, to devote your income increasingly to that, generates huge economic rents. So rising inequality may, I believe, be inherent both to rising prosperity beyond some level and to the current stage of technological conjuncture. And finally, my fourth point may not be wholly or even significantly resolvable through the policy deus ex machina, which pretty much all of us tend to wheel onto the stage at this stage in the argument, which is better education and a more highly skilled workforce. I think no amount of improved workforce skill is going to prevent global manufacturing jobs disappearing or make IT a job-intensive sector. And in many economic activities, I think there are winner-take-all effects, which mean that high-paid jobs go to the person with the highest relative perceived skill, somewhat irrespective of the relative skill level of the next best available worker. So what I'm suggesting is that we are facing something really quite profound, quite fundamental in rising inequality, that there may be no win-win solutions, and that it's a very important issue, employment and inequality, which we have on tomorrow's agenda. Now, my third candidate for fundamental challenges, a challenge which would be a challenge of substance in Roosevelt's terms, is climate change. This is a challenge of substance, not self-inflicted, in the sense that we do face a resource constraint, the limited, safe, absorptive capacity of the atmosphere, the danger of a severely harmful externality. So that's clear, and it's also right that we therefore have this on the agenda tomorrow morning. And I'd just like to make two comments on this agenda point. First, this is a hugely important challenge, but in principle is fixable at moderate cost. Second, that despite that moderate cost, this is a very difficult economic policy and political challenge at which we could easily fail. First, then, the cost is in principle moderate. Nick Stern estimated that it would cost about 2% of measured GDP foregone in 2050 in order by then to have reduced global emissions to about half current levels. And when the UK Climate Change Committee, which I've been chairing for the last 4 years, has done our own calculations of the cost on the UK economy required to meet what is now a UK statutory commitment to reduce our emissions by 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, we've always ended up getting to roughly the same figures that Nick Stern came up with, something like 1 to 2% of GDP. So this is a real cost. In Roosevelt's terms, it's not a phantom, it's not a self-inflicted wound, it's a real resource cost, it's a matter of substance, but actually it's not all those large. And those figures reflect the following facts. First, that there are a lot of improvements, of potential to improve energy efficiency at relatively low cost, and indeed some opportunities to improve energy efficiency at negative economic cost. There are below-the-line bits of the cost curve of projects. Secondly, low-carbon energy sources are typically more expensive than carbon-intensive sources, but not dramatically so. Suppose they turned out to be 30% more expensive. Well, developed economies spend about 6% of GDP on energy inputs. So that's 30% of 6%, which is roughly Nick Stern's 2%. Thirdly, low-carbon technologies are progressing and can progress further. They are going down learning curves quite dramatically, particularly, most hearteningly, I would say, over the last 3 years in relation to solar photovoltaic cells. So this is a big challenge, but one that can be met. But it will only be met with strong political commitment and a multifaceted policy response in which setting an appropriate carbon price is a necessary part of the approach, but not sufficient. Now, of course, to many old economic thinkers in INET terms, to conventional economics, it must be the case that a carbon price which reflects the externality ought to be not just a necessary, but a sufficient policy response. Because once you have a carbon price which prices in the externality, whippy, all the energy efficiency projects will become positive NPV and we'll rush out and do them. But that isn't the case because of multiple barriers and multiple path dependencies. And I'd like you to think about light bulbs. I'd like you to notice that these are not low-energy light bulbs, and I think if we ever come back here, we want to have that fixed. But the key point about energy-efficient light bulbs is that theoretically, they show up as one of the below-the-line projects on a cost basis. That broadly speaking, the capital cost of investing in energy-efficient light bulbs is offset by the lower energy cost over the whole life cycle. And I know that that means that every one of you has installed energy-efficient light bulbs. I know that you've done that because at your regular household investment project review sessions, which you hold with your spouses, your children, your partners, you have looked very carefully at the cash flows of alternative light bulb investment strategies, at the capital costs and the through-the-cycle running costs, and you calculated NPVs using discount rates which appropriately reflect your intertemporal utility preferences and the full set of available investment opportunities, taking into account the useful information provided by the market price of interest, appropriately risk-adjusted. Now, I know that that's what you've all done, but as was pointed out by a couple of speakers during the last day, there is out there that dangerous world where non-economists roam, and where it turns out that this household investment review procedure is not normal behavior. And if we are trying to pull through either changes in individual behavior or new investments by relying solely on price mechanisms, all our evidence in the Climate Change Committee in the UK is that we will make progress not nearly rapidly enough. Optimal climate policy needs to entail a complex combination of price and non-price levers. And on the technology development side, I suspect that it needs what Bill Janeway set out, I can't remember whether it was yesterday or today, I think it was yesterday, the idea of mission-driven investment, which, as he demonstrated, has been a distinguishing feature of several previous waves of technological change. We need to combine a confidence in the attainability of a low-carbon economy with a recognition of the great complexity and multifaceted nature of the policies required to achieve it. As long as we have that, I think we can overcome this fundamental challenge. But what of the self-inflicted wound of financial and macro instability? As I said, there ought here to be win-win solutions, because we're not dealing in this area with resource constraints or irreconcilable distributional conflicts. But are we clever enough to design and implement win-win solutions? On this, I want to make 2 points. First, that we need to recognize what terrible mistakes we made in getting into the position of the financial crash, and how dangerous the current position may still be. Second, that we need to be open to radical policy responses, free of the influence of industry lobbyists, but also free of the golden fetters of the intellect, and if necessary, of the golden fetters of received institutional rules. Hyman Minsky has been mentioned many times yesterday and today, and I think his analysis is absolutely central to our understanding of what went wrong. Banks can create credit and private money, and they can thus create leverage in the real economy and in their own balance sheets. That credit creation process, particularly when it is used to finance assets in constrained supply, whose value tends to rise in response to credit extended, and that in particular means real estate assets, can be incredibly powerfully procyclically self-reinforcing. Borrowers increasingly borrowing on the expectation of asset price rises, lenders convinced by rising asset prices that their loans are safe and that their losses will continue to be low. Unless controlled and offset, this process can build to a point of crisis and bust. That is what happened in the long swing up to 2008, but it is also the case that before the crisis, we not only failed to have policies which controlled that credit boom, but that we made it worse through catastrophic policy mistakes justified by poor economics. Regulators, quite bizarrely, I think, in retrospect, worked on the assumption, and stated it explicitly sometimes, that economizing on the use of bank capital, which is simply a phrase which means running the banking system at higher leverage, was socially optimal as well as privately optimal. And as a result, we allowed fractional reserve banks to run with capital and reserves, liquid asset reserves, which were not just inadequate, but woefully inadequate. I think the Basel II capital regime probably set a capital regime for banks, the absolute minimum, which was something like a tenth of a sensible, optimal strategy, capital ratio for banks. We also failed almost entirely to see that a shadow banking system had developed which was performing bank-like functions, i.e. maturity transformation, credit extension, and the creation of private money equivalent claims, but was doing so almost entirely outside our inadequate but still existent prudential standards. And meanwhile, the predominant strain of monetary economics, largely accepted as the iconic wisdom by the world's central banks, argued that current price stability was not only a necessary but a sufficient condition for financial and macroeconomic stability, with the credit cycle seen as something which neither could be nor needed to be controlled, and with the concrete realities of banks' balance sheets indeed largely absent from the models with which we were running this macroeconomic policy. These were terrible failures, terrible self-inflicted wounds, produced not by a plague of locusts, not by resource constraints, not by irreconcilable distributional conflict, but by intellectual error and the power of self-interested lobbies. So one task we have to do now is to make sure that the system is right for the future and that we have appropriately radical regulatory reform, that it is in place, and if necessary, that we put in place still more radical reforms. And we have made very considerable progress. We have greatly increased capital requirements in banks, though I am on the record of saying that in a perfect world, we would probably have gone still further. We have business to still do to address the issues of shadow banking, but the Financial Stability Board on which I sit is committed to come up with major policy proposals in that area by the end of this year. And we have begun to put in place macroprudential policy institutions and policies. In the UK, these will be exercised through the Financial Policy Committee, which will be able to pull quantitative levers which lean directly against credit booms, addressing the issue which Axel Leon-Hufford mentioned and reminded us of early this morning, the problem of multiple instruments and multiple targets, that we cannot use a price instrument of the interest rate focused on the achievement of price stability and expect it to achieve all that we need to achieve in terms of quantity constraints on credit. So we need to be robust in the implementation of these reforms and continually ask ourselves whether we have still yet been radical enough. But simultaneously, we need to cope with the deflationary aftermath of the bust. And here, we need, I think, to make sure that we are rereading Irving Fisher, as well as Hyman Minsky, and indeed some of what Ben Bernanke wrote in his essays on the Great Depression. And we have to recognize clearly how difficult is the process of deleveraging and how great the deflationary risks in the deleveraging part of a Minsky cycle. Japan had its Minsky moment 18 years before the US and Europe. And Richard Koo, who is here and I think is speaking tomorrow, has, I think, very clearly set out in his book the dynamics of corporate deleveraging after that Minsky moment and the corporate deleveraging which occurred in the Japanese economy. I think he argues totally convincingly that the large fiscal deficits which Japan ran and which offset the corporate sector financial surplus which emerged in the deleveraging process were absolutely essential for the balance of the Japanese economy, and that without them, Japan would have suffered not merely 2 decades of relatively low growth and gently falling deflation prices, but something much more severe, possibly a full Great Depression. But the problem with that argument, which I agree with Richard on, is it means that leverage is still there. The leverage hasn't gone away. It's simply moved from the corporate sector to the public sector, and total Japanese leverage across all sectors of the economy, debt as a percent of GDP, is actually higher than it was in 1990. And we've seen that same process in the US and in Europe, the process whereby in the aftermath of a credit bust, you can deleverage in some segments of the economy, but it's if you're sitting on a rather complex waterbed where the moment you press down here, it simply pops up elsewhere. Spain and Ireland, of course, particularly dramatic examples of that. Busts of private credit creation in Spain and Ireland leading to sovereign public debt problems in countries which previously had looked as if they had pretty tight control of their public finance. And I think we need to be very aware that there is that while absolute deflation is by no means certain, indeed I would say probably not probable, that there is a tail risk that we face now of spinning into serious deflation and ever-rising leverage. And I think it's a pretty fat tail risk. And I think it is far fatter, as Angel also argued this morning, than the tail risk on the inflationary side. I think there is a danger that in Japan, the government debt necessarily accumulated to offset corporate deleveraging is now at a scale whose repayment out of real resources is pretty much close to impossible, and that at some stage the markets may wake up to that fact and react to that fact in a classical multiple equilibria system. And I think in Europe, there are major dangers that fiscal austerity in the periphery will not achieve a reduction in debt burdens, but we will simply have the denominator of GDP chasing the numerator of debt in a downward spiral. I second think that there is a danger in Europe that in a system without either a federal debt or an acceptance that if there were a federal debt, there might be a need for straightforward monetization, i.e. quantitative easing, that the alternative of quantitative easing through LTROs, while undoubtedly essential last December to prevent a severe funding crisis, is unfortunately exacerbating one of the most severe problems that we face, which is the noxious interconnection between sovereign credit debt sustainability and bank credit worthiness. I don't think we should be under any delusions about the difficulties we still face in Japan in Europe, and perhaps to somewhat lesser extent in the US. And then yesterday, Bill White told us that in addition, we are out of ammunition, either fiscal or monetary, to deal with these problems. Now, I actually normally agree with Bill. I don't know where he is. He's probably here somewhere, but I normally agree with him, but I do not agree with him on this. I think it's actually very important to be clear that we are not out of ammunition to fight, if necessary, the tail risk of deflation. Simply because absolute deflation of output and prices simultaneously is one of the very few problems in economics where the ammo never, ever runs out. Bill Janeway yesterday quoted Keynes, and quote, "If the Treasury were to fill old bottles with bank notes, bury them at a suitable depth in disused coal mines, then we could just let workers dig them up and you would offset deflation." Now, is that fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus? Well, actually, it's the point in policy where the distinction between fiscal and monetary just collapses into one point, because the real-world interpretation of Keynes's words is overt money-financed fiscal deficits, monetary and fiscal policy combined. And before any of you decide that we've now reached the absolutely irresponsible far reaches of Keynesianism, of money-financed public deficits, do remember that this is also the far reach of monetarism, because Milton Friedman's helicopter money is exactly the same. The only difference, and it's slightly odd in this case, because John Maynard Keynes was not a Puritan, but in this case, John Maynard Keynes ended up in a more Puritan stance than Milton Friedman. He wanted people to actually have to dig the stuff up, whereas Milton Friedman was just going to leave it scattered around the ground. Now, the fact is that in a fiat money system, fiscal and monetary authorities acting in a coordinated fashion never run out of ammunition. They have a limitless arsenal from which to create aggregate nominal demand. Indeed, it is precisely because the arsenal is limitless that our main challenge most of the time when the fat tail risks are on the inflation side, is to put in place sufficiently powerful rules and systems of institutional independence that we prevent the misuse of this limitless arsenal. It's misuse to fund fiscal deficits, not in order to support nominal demand, but simply to enable fiscal profligacy for its own sake. Or its use in ways which reasonably create expectations of future irresponsible use, and therefore in ways which will de-anchor inflationary expectations. It's because of those dangers of the misuse of the limitless arsenal that we have some central banks, like the ECB, which have legal requirements never to monetize government debt, even temporarily, it is supposed. It's also why we require central banks to worry about the solvency of their balance sheets, even though the dirty little secret, which we don't tell to the external world, is that central banks are one of the very few institutions which don't need a solvent balance sheet and could run permanently with negative equity. These, like overt inflation targets, are commitment devices to constrain the misuse of potentially limitless powers in a fiat currency system. And like many commitment devices, they play an essential role. Arbitrary commitment devices are very important parts of workable political and economic systems. But it's vital to ensure that these commitment devices, designed to guard against inflation, do not restrain our ability to respond if the risks end up to come from the deflationary side. I certainly believe that the UK would now be in a clear recession if the Bank of England had been constrained by a non-monetization legal requirement and therefore unable to pursue its quantitative easing policy. The most important of the commitment devices is a symmetric and positive and symmetric inflation target. And without such a target, aggressively pursued if necessary to bring inflation up to target as well as down to target, there is a danger that even mild deflation can create combined public and private debts which become objectively unsustainable, the danger I fear in Japan. Central banks therefore need to be free to go to the far reaches of unconventional policy in the pursuit of positive and symmetric inflation targets. And if the fat-tailed deflation risks crystallize, it will be another self-inflicted wound, a compounding of the terrible policy mistakes by which we allowed the self-inflicted wound of financial excess, excessive leverage, credit boom, and crash. So, we dentists have a lot to worry about. We face major financial stability and macro challenges where win-win solutions ought to be possible, but where our pre-crisis technical competence was rather lacking, and where solutions may require the willingness to go down unconventional policy routes, which could be constrained by received rules or conventions. We face the fundamental but conquerable challenge of climate change, but still need political will and multifaceted policy in order to succeed. And we face growing inequality whose drivers may be more deeply rooted and inherent than we have yet fully realized. Fortuitously, all three of these issues are on this conference's agenda, and all three require new economic thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adair, for this very wide-ranging speech, and thanks also for making it so entertaining, which is especially appreciated after such a long day of technical speeches and discussions. And you've certainly made good on your promise of talking about what matters. And I won't even attempt to give a summary because it was so wide-ranging and can speak for itself. And I also don't want to cut down on the time that you all have to ask questions, maybe challenge his thoughts, since he really has given us a lot of food for thought, as was to be expected. I have to admit that I didn't prepare for moderating at a dentistry convention, and I'm not entirely sure of the customs of this profession, so I'll just pretend that it's still an economist convention and keep to those rules. I'll stand up so that I can better see you when you raise your hand. I would ask you, please don't forget to identify yourself and maybe your institution for the benefit of the others in the room who might be quite far away from you. And with my bad eyesight, there's no chance that I will recognize you, even if you're Madonna or George Clooney. It just won't happen, so you'll have to do it yourself. Yeah. And please keep your question short so that we can take more questions, please.
Thank you. Heather Graby from the Open Society. There's a big blame game going on in Europe about the crisis, and perhaps we should make this blame game a little bit longer term by thinking about what our grandchildren might blame us for in terms of our response. And Adair, you talked a great deal about the helicopter money and very entertainingly and how it might be better distributed and so on. But should we actually connect that issue with the question of growth and the question of climate change? Should we be paying a lot more attention to what exactly quantitative easing is used for, particularly the question about green growth and the transformation to a low-carbon economy? Because after all, both spending any kind of fiscal stimulus and also structural reform money, for example, the structural funds of the European Union, on a shift to the low-carbon economy could have a double benefit. it could both have the requisite stimulus effect, but also the shift to low carbon is often a very labor-intensive process. It involves things like insulation of houses, changing of infrastructure, of energy infrastructure, which requires a lot of man-hours, a lot of labor. So could that issue actually address both of your concerns, number 1 and number 3, as well as just giving us a better story about how we coped with the crisis to the long-term benefit of our grandchildren?
Should we take 2 or 3? Take 2 or 3. Take 2 or 3. Yep.
3 questions at a time, so that we get more questions in. Are there any more questions here, please, at the same table?
You may not be in a position to be completely candid,
You'll be referred.
but you, along with Mervyn King and Andrew Haldane, were singularly aggressive in attempting to rein in the financial sector. And I know that you sort of worked it into your talk, and yet that sort of wasn't the focus of your talk. But there are a lot of people in this room, and I'm certainly one of them, that believes that constraining the financial sector is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for getting us on the right path. And this is a you talked, for example, about income inequality, and you suggested that might be inherent, at least in the US. Income inequality is significantly a function of CEO pay and the favored tax position that hedge funds and particularly PE funds can obtain. So in the US, income inequality is significantly a function of people who are either beneficiaries of the current deregulated financial regime or can piggyback on it. But you only won half a loaf in the UK. I mean, the fight was very impressive, and I wish, and there are a lot of people in the US who are rooting for you. And we've got a group in the room that's very influential. And given the position that you fought a fight and got a lot of ground that in no other advanced economy was won, and this fight is still continuing and hasn't been won, what advice can you give us in terms of messaging or tactics that would be helpful? Because this is a fight that's critically important, and we'd like your insights.
There's a third question here. And then in the next round, we'll go back there at the right. There's a couple of questions there.
It's Thomas Clower with the European Council on Foreign Relations in Paris. Thank you very much for a fascinating speech. I was particularly drawn into your musings, if I may call them that, about the origins of rising income inequality. And I would like to draw you out a little further, if I may, and ask you for a hunch. Do you think that the nation states, the existing states, would have or will have in future the power to do something through taxation on managing that trend, if it is becoming a long-term structural trend which will destabilize our societies? Or do they not, in fact, have they no longer the power to tackle this issue? And do we need to look at global, supranational, regional answers? It's interesting to see that this is coming up in the French election, of course, with the Hollande proposal. People around Hollande themselves say that the 75% taxation will, of course, not happen. Thank you.
Okay, 3 questions. So the first one from Heather here was, should I put together the story about macro stabilization and fighting deflation and the story about climate change? And to be honest, I'm not certain I want to do that. I think there is a value in economic discussions of having a clarity of separation of what you're talking about, where I'm a little bit wary sometimes of what people think of as the holistic approach. For instance, there is a tendency on climate change for people to say not only is Nick Stern right that it's only 1 or 2% of GDP, that by the time you've got the green economy and the jobs created, there isn't any cost at all. The only trouble is, I think the economic analysis says there is a small cost. I think in measured GDP terms, we will be slightly worse off in 2050. And I think it's very, very important to tell people that in advance for political legitimacy reasons. Because although that 2% is pretty small in total, it shows up in some highly visible things like higher electricity prices for ordinary people. And those higher electricity prices are non-trivial as a percent of an electricity bill. They're like sort of 10 or 15%, and they're visible. So if we are to guard against a backlash against policies, we can't too much tell a story, don't worry, there's no cost here because of the green economy creation, and then suddenly they say their electricity bill go up. You've actually got to have a strategy which tells them that their electricity bill will go up by a certain amount, but in the total round of their total income, that is not a huge amount. You may then also have to do things for particular poorer people for whom their electricity bill is a rather important element. So on the whole, I'm a little bit wary of it. I don't exclude the possibility that when you are doing job creation encouragement, you are absolutely right that some of the things we need to do for the green agenda, in particular the insulation of homes, is very precisely an employment-intensive activity which uses precisely the people who have been laid off by the construction busts which have occurred. And if we can do sensible combination of things like that, we should do. The second question, I think, asked me whether I had any advice for winning American political debates, if it could come down to that. I'm not very strong on that. There are some irrational features to American politics which I think are way beyond my pay grade to try and work out. The point you did make, though, there's 2 points I'd just like to pick up. You're absolutely right that in the story of inequality, although I talked about a whole number of different factors, some of them are not to do with the financial system. The financial system is a non-trivial part of that story, both directly and indirectly. As the very fine article by Philippon and Reshef has shown, one of the stunning features of the pre-crisis period is a very significant increase in remuneration, skill-adjusted in the financial sector relative to the rest of the economy in exactly the same way that occurred in the 1920s. And that is important not only in itself, but also I think it has a reference approach within CEO pay. I have sat on remuneration committees where people have said, well, why are you bothering about challenging this rate of pay for our CEO? It's less than our investment banking advisors are paid. Inequality does work on a cross-reference process which establishes social norms. So I think the financial system is relevant. Finally, the hunch. What was the hunch on? The degrees of freedom available to national governments to still pursue progressive income policies, etc. In sum, not limitless, but not nil. I suspect that Francois Hollande will be pushing the limits of it if he tries to have a 75% tax. I suspect that at that level you do start producing unhelpful to the French finances movements across borders. But I suspect that once you get down to 50 or 45, actually you don't make all that much difference, and the element of proof for that is the success of the Scandinavian economies, which are quite clearly some of the most successful economies in innovation, in growth, in employment creation, and which still have significantly redistributive, progressive systems. And I think that's an empirical test of a degree of national freedom, provided you don't try and push it too far.
Thank you very much. Now the move back there toward the wall.
Yes,
And
hi,
please
I'm
don't forget
Faiza
to
Shaheen
identify
from the
you.
New Economics Foundation. I did agree with your analysis of the way that the labour market's going, and we in the UK can already see a very polarised labour market. But interested in this idea of that it's intractable, and I'm a bit wary of this shrugging it off, because actually, as you began to get at, I think just then, was that it's very important, tackling economic inequality is very important to tackling financial instability. And also when you look now at fuel poverty and the way that we're going to tackle climate change, again, economic inequality and doing something about that is a necessity to then do something also about those problems.
I think there were more questions in that corner. Yes, please, lady.
Hello, my name is Anne Pettifor from Policy Research in Macroeconomics. I just want to, I first of all want to welcome Lord Turner's speech tonight. It makes me proud to be British in a very European environment. But I want to just challenge one point, which is one that's often mentioned in debates, which is that the 1970s inflation was driven by high wage demands, when in reality in Britain it was stimulated in the first instance by the Competition and Credit Control Act, which was all competition and no control, and allowed the banks to begin creating credit. So the inflation of the 1970s was about too much money chasing too few goods and services. And of course the unions reacted to that, but they were not causal. They were reaction to the Competition and Credit Control Act. And I really think we have to get that right if we're going to address the threat that deregulation poses today. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. The third question will be here. The gentleman. Is there a microphone that he can get? Yes.
Okay. So I guess I want to push back a little bit on your statement about the cost of climate change. In that, suppose you were President Roosevelt, and in 1941, you gathered your counselors and said, if we want to go to war against Germany and Japan, what is it going to cost us? The answer would be, your advisors would go off and calculate all the costs, and it would be horrendous. And you would be saying, well, you know, the fiscal cost, of course, the cost of lives is going to be horrible too, but forget about that for a moment. And yet, you know, if you look at the GDP of the United States, which fell off of its, you know, growth path since 1860 in the Depression, the war started, it shot back up and actually got on the same path it had been on before. So when you tally it all up, I suspect that actually the cost of the war was negative. And secondly, well, the uncertainty, because we talk about the economy. Nick Stern makes this mistake. I suspect you're making the mistake, as if the economy always grows. But you know, we did have about 1,000 years from 450 AD to the Renaissance, where the economy shrank. And that could happen again. It could happen again, triggered by global warming, in fact. And so I worry that the uncertainties are not being factored in, and any statement about the mean is misleading because the variance is so much bigger than the mean. And secondly, if you look at interest rates, which are fluctuating, you don't get exponential present value calculations anymore. You get calculations that deviate dramatically from exponentially and again, favor the fact that the costs are not as big as we think. So I think I'm worried that the way you're talking about it makes me squeamish in the certainty with which you express the conclusion.
Thank you.
First of all, you know, I said that it may be that rising inequality is intractable, but I very carefully said intractable at the pre-tax level, i.e. that our ability through the classic interventions that everybody likes, which is education and skilling people up, to go against the increase in the relative dispersion which is compatible with full employment, that our ability to do that may be slight. But actually the immediate consequence of that is that in those circumstances we should be very wary of giving up on a classic role of the state, which is the progressive redistribution of the pre-tax distribution of income. And I think one of the really concerning things, and at one level surprising things, of the last 30 years is at a period of time in which we have had dramatic increases in pre-tax inequality, rather than leaning against that at least marginally through the progressive tax system, we have continually dismantled the progressivity of the tax system and therefore multiplied even more dramatically the inequality effects. So yes, I actually think there is a role for the classic role of progressive taxation as the thing that takes the inequalities of capitalism and somewhat, not totally, but somewhat equalizes them. Secondly, the issue of the causes of UK stagflation. I enjoyed your question. because I did undergraduate economics in Cambridge in the 1970s, and the thing which I seemed to spend, the question was always, what is the causes of stagflation? What is the causes of our current inflation, and why is it being combined? With high unemployment? I think you are partly right. I think competition and credit control is a sort of important development, an important stage in the development of a belief that we can ignore quantitative figures on the credit and money side and therefore simply rely on the interest rate. As somebody said, it had a lot of competition. It didn't have much control to it. It was a slightly misnamed article. I think it is fundamental. It's fundamental to the credit boom that occurs in the 1970s. But I would not exclude the role of trade unions. I think the ability of the trade unions to resist, in particular, the real wage impact of oil price increases. When you have an oil price increase, you have a movement in the terms of trade. It is fairly important to what happens to inflation, whether that is effectively resisted in the labour market or not. And so I used to believe then, when I wrote those essays, that there was a role of trade unions. And until I dig out my old essays and go all the way back through it again, I probably still believe it a bit today. Thirdly, the costs of climate change. Very interesting comparison you make with the Second World War. I mean, what is absolutely true is that in actual sacrifice during the war, the sacrifice during the war is just off the scale in terms of the sacrifice of climate change. You're talking about, defeating Hitler took 30, 40, 50% of GDP, quite apart from the social cost and the human cost. And one thing I say is that if Nick Stern is roughly right, and we still fail to do this action on climate change, future generations will think of us as just utterly pathetic compared with those in the past which have made serious sacrifices on behalf of future generations. I take your point about the uncertainty of some of these measures. I also take your point about we shouldn't assume economic growth has always occurred. You're absolutely right. There's a long period of time in which there is effectively zero economic growth. The great historian of that is Angus Maddison, whose analysis of the long-term growth figures, I think, is magisterial. And it's absolutely right that up until about 1750 in Britain, average rates of growth were either nil or was something like 0.1% per capita per annum, rather than the twos that we then got used to. I do, however, think that the breakthrough that occurred from 1750, which puts in place a set of institutions and a set of mechanisms of perpetual technological inquiry and perpetual investment, that those institutions, which are the institutions both of the post-Enlightenment intellectual inquiry system and the institutional mechanisms of capitalism with its capital markets and its banks for all their faults, probably mean that this process of economic growth, once unleashed, is likely, even if not essential to human happiness, to be somewhat permanent. That's what I believe. Finally, I do entirely agree with you to be very, very careful of discount rates and MPV calculations. And in fact, Nick Stern was very clear on this. For the purposes of his report, he felt he had to engage with the debate within the economic profession about the appropriate discount rate to apply to the future. But he also said, actually, this is an ethical issue. I mean, here's an interesting thing about discount rates. If you assume that GDP, measured income, captures all that is relevant to human welfare, and if you assume that climate change will destroy the world entirely in 2150, and if you assume that it was going to cost us 6% of GDP today to stop it, you wouldn't at a 4% discount rate act, because the entire GDP in 2150 discounted at 4% is less than 6% today. And Nick actually looked at that and said, this is absurd. The discount rate that you should apply is not something that you can take out of the market experience. It's an ethical statement as to our responsibility for future generations. Which is why my way of thinking about it, I don't use the MPV figures. I simply say, is this doable? It is doable. I think it's doable at a cost which is not massive. Even if it was 3 or 4 times the 2%, I'd still say we've got to do it. But I still think there is some value in putting some figure work around it.
Thank you, Adair. And thank you all for being so disciplined and holding back a little bit with your... If we hold back a little bit with our private conversations, I know it's hard because there's so much to discuss, but that will enable us to have another round, and there's quite a few questions out there still. I've seen somebody there. The lady, please.
Right, so I was quite inspired by your introducer, Norbert Herring, who said that you might actually say something about predators. And at the same time, I kind of felt confused that you talked about, I wrote inside your book, I hope you don't mind, inequality, long-run growth, and climate change, but the connections between these 3 things in your talk, the structural connections, I didn't really understand. So I want to propose and then ask you a question on what you think the particular solution would be on how the predatory agents actually connect these 3. So the first thing, just 3 facts. 1, inequality rose especially in the 1990s, which was a period of growth. This was not a period of recession. This was a period in which the US, as well as many European economies, were investing heavily in long-run growth activities, for example, in the US in terms of the whole dot-com boom before the bust. However, this was also, as with every innovation wave, as you quoted Bill Janeway, and many of us have written about this, innovation was very collective, in which the state played a huge role. And the problem with inequality is that even though the state played a huge role, the returns from this innovative long-run growth period were actually captured in a predatory style from particular financial agents, including venture capital. And this is because innovation is a cumulative, path-dependent process. So if you think of it in terms of a curve, where you position yourself on this curve allows you to capture the entire integral instead of just the marginal returns. So in terms of climate change, if we hope that the state plays a role, like Nick Stern and many of us who are working with him are hoping the state would play, because this is an early revolution. The green revolution is, in fact, potentially the next internet. We would hope that the state could actually, in this case, actually earn back a return and not just give a complete giveaway to the venture capitalists and the shareholders, which in the previous wave captured the return, even though the innovation process was very collective. So the question to you is, in what way can you, in the position that you play, which is a very powerful position in financial services, actually reform not only what banks are doing, but what, for example, private equity, the venture capitalists, and the shareholders have done in the 1990s, which has gotten much more out of the period of growth than what they put in. Because I think that we continue to mythologize the role of, for example, venture capital compared to the role of the state.
To the right, from my perspective, the gentleman.
Thank you, Lord Turner, for your wonderful talk. I ask you a question about inequality. So, of the 7 billion people in the world, the 3 to 4 billion people in the middle are converging in income on the top billion as fast as the bottom billion is diverging from the top 5 to 6 billion. What's the question in inequality that we face? Thank you. The question on inequality that we face when the bottom billion, as Paul Collier says. Thank you.
There was another lady before, is that right? No. Here, a little further forward. Yeah. Please, go ahead.
Hi, Cameron Hepburn from the London School of Economics. I was very pleased to hear you connect the challenges of climate change and inequality, and I've been struck by how difficult it is to reconcile the two of them, particularly when working with the Chinese. I also noted your use of the phrase pre-tax income, and was glad to hear you comment on that. But I'd like to push you a bit further to say, given that rather than lean against the wind, we've seen governments being blown around by the wind over the last couple of decades, what prospects are there for addressing post-tax inequality with the welfare state, and how might that help us with addressing climate change?
Thank you very much. Adair?
Well, the first question, I'm not sure how to answer, because the first question started by saying that you hadn't seen what was my purported link between inequality, climate change, growth, and the credit side. And the reason why you couldn't see it was I didn't present one. Because there probably is one, but I hadn't got that far. You know, I've been scribbling all day, and you know, that was as far as I got. So that's why there wasn't a clear link between those. And you know, is there a link? I think actually there may be some interesting links, but not fully explored. I do think there's some intriguing links between inequality and financial instability, on which I think the best book is Raghu Rajan's Fault Lines. I think Raghu's argument that what happened in the US is that you have a rising inequality to which in the US political system a taxation-based redistribution is not a legitimate response, which then brings a response which is simply to flood poorer people with credit, I think actually is really quite an insight into the political dynamics of what lay behind the subprime disaster in the US. I think also there are some interesting questions in economics not explored for quite a long period of time about the links between inequality and aggregate demand. This goes back to the work of Michael Kaleski, whom some of you may know, developed a model of aggregate demand, which assumed on a simple basis that capitalists save and workers consume. But clearly there are very significant differences in marginal propensity to save and consume between different sectors of the economy, different sectors of the income distribution, and that there may be some rather important links which emerge there. As for what I can do about private equity, shareholders, etc., I mean, honestly, you know, my job at the FSA, you know, what I pray is that we're not going to have another banking disaster. I try and survive month by month, and that the system doesn't keel over. And if I get to the end of the job and we haven't done another banking disaster, I'll feel pretty good. So I do try and set the limits to all the problems we're going to try and solve. Though I agree there's some very interesting issues there. I think in particular, within the financing space, the extent to which some of the vehicles which initially called themselves venture capital eventually ended up doing essentially just leveraged buyouts, which were, well, as someone once said, if you have high leverage, a rising market, and tax deductibility of interest rates, everybody looks like a business genius. So there were some relatively easy gains there, which were not really venture capital in a way that I think, for instance, Bill Janaway was talking about it. The second point was on inequality in the bottom billion. I actually agree with you. And I did say early on that the area where growth still matters is the bottom billion. I'm a great admirer of Paul Collier's work on that. And I think what we have to realize is that there are some countries in the world just not participating in this success so far. There are several countries in Africa, also some regional bits of India. I mean, the extent to which India is regionally different between the successful states and the less successful states is very important. And I think actually what we realize is that the formula of catch-up is not universal. It doesn't always work. I happen to think that demography is more important than we realize here. I think there are some countries which still have birth rates which make it almost impossible for them to begin to achieve the rate of capital accumulation and skill formulation which will put them on the sustainable growth path. And those were insights which were fundamental to development economics back in the 1960s and 70s, and I think that we were wrong to move away from. The final question, I think, was on, again, climate change and inequality, and I can't remember what it was. But I think I tried to answer it here by saying, you know, I think we've got to be careful of always saying everything is linked to everything else. I mean, there clearly are some, there are ethical issues of equity on climate change. I think it's particularly the case that the adverse costs of climate change may well be least in rich, temperate zone countries like Northwest Europe, and highest in some of the bottom billion countries in the desertifying Sahel. And I think that's an ethical issue at the global level, which we need to take seriously. I fear my answer is inadequate, but it is getting late, and I suspect everybody wants to go to the bar. So, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Adair. Thank you for taking all these questions so seriously, and I apologize to all those who didn't have a chance to ask their questions. And thank you very much to the organizers for putting all this together.
Thank you, Norbert. I need your attention for a moment because there are a number of lessons that I think we need to derive from this conversation. The first of which, Adair, is that this is the first time I've ever been winded in listening to a lecture. How you maintain such a pace, to me, is extraordinary. I think we all have to make some agreements here. We're now part of a community. This is the third year of INET. And we all have to agree to use dental floss because the idea that economists and dentists are similar is terrifying, and I don't want any of you to get cavities. In light of your discussion of jobs, I don't think any of us ever ought to resign again because those jobs are disappearing and I don't know where to go. Eve Smith asked a question that I think the subset of the members of INET who are Americans should now begin to lament the fact that we won the revolution because, as she mentioned, Mervyn King, Adair Turner, and Andy Haldane from the INET board have done so much better on financial regulation. We may be sinking our own ship because a couple hundred years ago we were impetuous enough to win. I think the most important pledge we have to make tonight is that when we are reincarnated, we have to all pledge to go to the primary schools that Adair Turner attended so that we have a fighting chance of learning the kind of oratory skills and technique that he's demonstrated 3 years in a row. Now, I have no greater faith that I could do what he did tonight than I could write a song like Lennon or McCartney. But we all have an obligation to do our best, and I think we have to pray for that reincarnation through the primary schools that he attended. I'm not waiting for 9 months to arrive. I'm getting a 3-month head start. And Adair, you've been a good friend to me and a good friend to INET, but I'm putting the invitation down right now. And finally, just a word of advice from me as a friend of Adair. If he ever has you over to dinner, make sure you upgrade your light bulbs. Thank you very much.